the absence of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, what sort of an impact is that going to make?
So, look, if you look at where China is today, China is completely dependent on the global economy. Growth in China is declining. It's below 5%. That's a historical low. The buffers have been used up. The room to maneuver is less. And if external markets shrink, that will make it even more difficult for China to rebound. So whether a leader attends or not, the reality is that China is as dependent on the global economy today as it was in the heydays of globalization, and China will need to interact with the rest of the world. And so I see no way out, barring very low growth if China chooses to go that way, for China not to be part of the global system. And frankly, Russia is in a similar position. It's in the midst of sanctions. You can see what has happened. The ruble has fallen, growth is low, and Russia is dependent on the global economy.
Let me just get another voice in to talk to us about that. Riva Ganguly Das joining us, former Secretary East of the Ministry of External Affairs. She's been Ambassador, of course. Ambassador Das, thank you for being with us. We're looking at this from multiple perspectives of how people are looking at it. We were looking at the European view, British view. But when you look at the East, how do you think countries in the East and other countries in the South are going to be looking at G20? What are their expectations? What would they like to see achieved over the next couple of days?
First, thank you for inviting me to this program. I think India has, right from the beginning, made it very clear that it wants it to be a voice of the Global South Summit. And the geography that you mentioned mostly has the countries from the South. So there is a lot of expectation. And India has taken the very unusual step of bringing in the global voices of Global South right at the beginning of its presidency by hosting the Global South Summit, where 125 countries participated. Also, what is very significant is the invitation to the guest countries. And if you see the countries which have been invited, and I would like to particularly speak about Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina has just met Prime Minister Modi, and, a very special neighbor for us and a country where our policy of neighborhood first, act east, and in a sense, our outlook to Indo-Pacific, all of it sort of converges there. And it's a very, very special relationship. And, so the voices of these countries are being represented in this G20, and which India has very specifically said that it is a human-centric growth which it is looking for, and growth, the sustainable development goals, where we are missing out on the goals, which because of COVID, after effects of COVID, and then a lot of good development assistance is going to the Ukraine. So these are all issues which directly concern the Global South, not to mention climate change, women-led development, and environmental issues.
Right. On that note, Mr. Tiwari, let me just come back to you for one last view. The fact that, in all probability, one of the most concrete results of G20, and hopefully there'll be many concrete results, but one that we are hearing a lot about is the fact that the African Union might finally get a seat on the table. Is that something that you think would be a major achievement and something that New Delhi will always be remembered for? Africa getting its long-deserved seat at the high table.
Absolutely. Look, if in a few years, the African continent will be an economic superpower. It has 6 of the 12 fastest growing countries. If it could become the largest free trade area, over 1 billion people. It is the most distressed region in terms of climate change. It is at the center of development. And therefore, Africa needs to be brought squarely in. And if India can do it, it'll be a major achievement in the expansion of the G20 in the last 3 decades.
Right. Mr. Siddharth Tiwari, thank you so much for having spoken to us and shared your perspective with us on that question of the African Union. Whom better to speak to than Gurjeet Singh, who's now joining us, former ambassador to the African Union, and perhaps somebody who can tell us how this would be seen all across Africa. This could be a tangible outcome. All of us are keeping our fingers crossed. Of course, nothing is ever done till it's done. But if this becomes one of the tangible takeaways from New Delhi, the African Union being part of G20, what would be the reaction in Africa? And how might that affect India's position in Africa? I know India and China and other countries have been justing for influence and, we've done something for Africa sort of a thing for a while. How will this be seen?
So undoubtedly, it has already drawn very positive comments because nobody has ever taken Africa to the global stage except India. Please remember the Bandung Conference 1945, the non-aligned movement 1961. It has always been India which has been a partner of Africa in its place at the high tables. No other presidency of the G20 had the courage to amend the membership. India took that risk and said, we will expend diplomatic capital and we will try and persuade a divided world to come back to this and agree on something rather than only quibble over Ukraine. So I think this is something big that India is trying to do, and I remain confident that we will do it. Through this, India shows that the Europeans can't simply get together in the G20 and continue trying to run it like a G7. We need much better results. We need delivery of promises, and we need fulfillment. And African countries bring the results of that to us, how unfulfilled promises mean to the countries concerned. But let's not forget that along with the trying to get the AU in, India has also tried to balance South Africa from Africa. South Africa largely represents Southern Africa. So India has invited Nigeria, has invited Egypt, and Comoros as the chair of the African Union, and Comoros is a representative of Eastern Africa. So 4 of the 5 regions of Africa are today in New Delhi to attend the G20 Summit. So this is the largest African representation that any presidency has tried to do, other than those who call them to side events.
All right, that's a really interesting point of view. Anil Wadhwa now joining us, also former ambassador, also former Secretary East. So we've got ambassadors all across, and 2 people who've been former Secretary East at the Ministry of External Affairs. So this is really the right sort of a panel to try and understand. We've spoken about all that's happened with Ukraine and Russia and what's going to be happening with the West. So let's spend some time looking at the South. Ambassador Wadhwa, we were talking a week or 2 weeks ago about some of the agendas that could be building up to this. What was just being said about the African Union, is that a major deliverable? Or some of the other points also which are being discussed when it comes to digital infrastructure or the developmental agenda? What would be some of the highlights you'd look for in the next 2-3 days? Ambassador Wadhwa.
Well, certainly the inclusion of the African Union in the G20 is a big step. And I'm pretty certain that will receive support from the European Union. In fact, a number of countries have come forward and expressed support for that idea. But most importantly, I think, this is a presidency which is from the very beginning concentrated on the development agenda, as you pointed out. And most importantly, I think since we have agreed and we have offered to share our digital pack, that's very important for a number of African countries in particular, where there are lack of even banking facilities, and that helps a lot in terms of their development. Plus the fact that we've laid a lot of emphasis on debt vulnerability, and we have also talked about health emergency preparedness, digital health innovation, and cooperation in pharmaceuticals. All this favors the developing countries. And at the same time, we have also talked about mitigation of climate change issues by climate financing. And that, of course, we've said can be done through the reform of multilateral lending institutions, because they have to get into the act. Otherwise, the global south will have no finances, and the promises that have been made to them will not be fulfilled. So this is an agenda which is primarily driven by the motivation of carrying those people who are left out with us. And I think the January meeting in which happened of the Global South here in New Delhi, where 125 countries were represented,
Right.
that was something which is a great initiative. It has taken this development agenda even further.
Ambassador Das, if I could just throw that to you. Look, this G20 is following on the back, of course, of SCO, then there was BRICS, and there was ASEAN right now. Now G20 is taking place. Let's face it, and not to put too fine a point on it, there is a certain position that China is increasingly taking in the world. Xi Jinping is not going to be here, and that's probably great. But that's obviously one of the factors that India has to keep in mind. How do you see all of this playing itself out? We saw the dynamics at ASEAN also. We saw the dynamics that played out in parts of East Asia and Southeast Asia after that Chinese standard map came up. Do you think this is a good opportunity? G20 eventually would be a great opportunity really for India to try and do something it's often tried to do and spoken about, and which has really talked the language of the G20 and talk about it. But the question around that, sorry, it's a wrong question. The question around that will always be, in other areas, India's interests are also with the West. So how do you see this balancing act playing itself out, the North-South divide?
When India took over the presidency of the G20, it was a very difficult situation. Already, the world, which was only beginning to recover from COVID, saw the Ukraine-Russia war. So in terms of global debt, economic growth, fuel and food insecurity, these were the problems which the world was already facing. We all accept, it's a reality that it's a much more polarized world than ever before. The divisions, East-West divisions, North-South divisions are probably sharper than ever before. And so G20 in that sense, which is the presidency of G20 in that sense, gives India a great opportunity to showcase what it stands for. And India has made it very clear right from the beginning that a lot of its presidency will be about, lessons learned, sharing experiences, capacity building, and showing the world where we have reached as a nation. Today, it's a very proud day for all Indians when we see, that we are hosting such a grand event. As a Foreign Service officer, I've attended many such events in all parts of the world. But to see that we are doing it here in Delhi is really a very, very proud moment for all of us. And I think, India is showing the leadership that it really deserves. It's in terms of its growth, in terms of, at multilateral meetings for years together, we've seen how India's voice is heard and, how we determine a lot of the negotiations are determined by India's position. So this is really a very action-oriented G20. And I think I have absolutely no doubt that the joint communique, whether we get a joint communique or we get a chairman's statement, we'll have plenty of deliverables for the G20 nations to work on. And then there are these various other outfits at which these are then acted upon. So I think India has kept the practical aspect of the grand ideas very much in focus. And I think it will be a G20 presidency which will leave its mark on the history of G20.
Right. If I could turn back to you, Ambassador Gurjeet Singh. Let's turn our attention back to Africa, because the message being given to countries like Africa would also work perhaps in Latin America or other countries of the global south. India has often tried to say that our approach is very different to the Chinese approach. China will build infrastructure projects for you, get you into debt, and then you're going to be in a debt trap, and then you're going to be struggling how to repay it, and then China will take over assets. Let's face it, that's what China has been doing. At least subtly, a lot of what seems to be said. We've been seeing these absolutely fantastic images from the Mandapam, from, for example, showcasing digital infrastructure and saying, this is the sort of a thing that India can share with you, and it's not expensive. You don't have to pay us a lot of money. You're not going to get into debt to us, and you don't have to actually be pledging your assets. Is that going to be a the sort of a subtext to a lot of what is being said to countries like the representatives from Africa?
Thank you. So certainly, I think today and tomorrow and day after are absolutely great days in our lifetime, as Riva said, as foreign service officers. This is the biggest collection of big powers in India ever. So I think this is truly a momentous occasion. Now, can we take the momentum of this occasion to really change the lot of the global south, particularly in Africa? And what you have said, yes, the digital public goods is something that can help many developing countries. I was in Jakarta just the other day for the Indo-Pacific Forum, and everybody was buzzing us about this aspect alone and saying what could have taken 50 years to have financial inclusion, India has done in 7. So I think this has made a big impact. And also the pace at which India continues to grow is impressive. So most people today look for technology and economic cooperation, and they know that India is a benign power and India will not impose conditions. It never has on Africa or on others. Right. But the problem that remains is how do we protect the portals of the big discussion forum, whether in the UN or the G20, from crisis like Ukraine. Now, frankly, if our friends in the G7 had not emphasized it repeatedly and let it be, there would not have been this doubt about a leader's communique or not. Similarly, we also need to see that unilateral sanctions also make a big difference.
All right,
so how can we acknowledge that?
Right, I think we are flat out of time, so we're just going to have to leave it there. Tomorrow we'll be back to try and summarize everything that happened. But maybe in just 30 seconds, Ambassador Badwa, you can leave us with some parting thoughts. Look, you're talking about it being a proud moment. I have to say, in my career as a journalist, been to many events, been to Davos 15 times. I have to say, both the Bharat Mandapam, the convention center, the sort of infrastructure that exists, actually a matter of some pride to see all of that happening right here in India. But of course, though that's the imagery, that's all the spectacle. Actual work has to be done to also keep it going. Any last thoughts from you? Big headlines to keep in mind for the next 2 days.
I think India has worked very hard on this in its presidency and organized a number of excellent events, a number of meetings that have been held, the 15 ministerials, all of them have come up with excellent recommendations. I just hope that this presidency at the end of it is satisfied with a New Delhi declaration, which is adopted by consensus. If not, as Riva said, we still have a chairman's statement, which will have a lot of deliverables for the future for G20.
All right. I'd like to thank all of you so much for joining us. Ambassador Das, Ambassador Gurdeep Singh, Ambassador Badwa, thank you all so much for having been with us to shed light on what we should expect in the next couple of days.